Thank you very much for all coming. This is the first year program lecture series. And before we get started, I'd like to thank a number of people for helping us put this on. The first is Professor Newton, who's the Dean of the College of Science. So I'd like to thank him and the College of Science for their support in this program. And to also thank Cengage Learning for helping us with some of the support as well. This program has been running for a number of years and has been, I think, pretty successful in bringing interesting individuals to come and talk about matters that are of current interest and also have some overlap with chemistry, which you're all taking at the moment. At this time, I'd also like to thank Dow, both for helping in support of this lecture series, but also in supporting your laboratory experience. So they provide funding to help you do the experiments that you're currently doing. So I'd like to thank Dow for that. The talks that we have in the first year lecture series cover a variety of topics. These are two from last year: the Global Energy Challenge by Daniel Nocera, and one on glucose metabolism by Mark Lennox. And this last fall, some of you may have gone to some of these. Jim Stevens talked about feedstocks, and Catalina Ockham talked about. Tonight we have a very special guest, Professor Gerald North. My name is also North with no relation. From the Atmospheric Sciences Department at Texas A&M. Professor North got his bachelor's in physics from the University of Tennessee and his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, also in physics. In fact, his early career was very much involved with the molecular and the atomic scale of things. But then in his career, after spending some time, I think, at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, he took a much more global view of things and became involved in meteorology and climate change at that point. He's been at a number of places, but he's been at Texas A&M for 25 years, where he's currently one of our distinguished professors in atmospheric science. He was also the holder of the Harold Haynes Endowed Chair in Atmosphere and Geosciences. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Professor North, who is an internationally recognized scientist in the area of climate change. He's won many accolades in this area, including recently the Jewel Charney Award from the American Meteorological Society, which honors and recognizes excellence in scientific research in the area of atmospheric sciences. So please join me in a warm welcome for Professor North.
Are we turned on? We're turned on? Okay. Thank you, Simon. And howdy to everybody here. Very much. I've never said that before, but I've worked here 25 years. Tonight's talk is going to be about global climate change and how chemistry gets involved in it. So this is my lead slide. Here's a picture of our planet taken from a satellite. Probably one of the space shuttles, I'm not really sure, but it's a beautiful picture. You can see the curvature of the Earth and the thinness of the atmosphere that overlays the planetary surface. So let's get on. Here's the outline of what I intend to tell you tonight. I'd like to show you a little bit of the evidence for man-made climate change. And I'd like to talk about the balance of radiation. So it's going to be a science talk, not just politics or hand-waving and that sort of thing. I'm going to talk about science. So what are these greenhouse gases that people are talking so much about these days? What about infrared radiation and molecules? I think after all, you're all taking chemistry, you know about molecules. How much does the Earth's climate change? How much should it change? And then what's the future of climate research? So let's get going. So there are three pillars that climate change understanding rests upon. First one is the record of warming. Planet has been warming. Number two is the increases in greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, and others. And then finally, the theory of the piece that I care the most for and find the most convincing is actually the theory. The thing that connects the upper two. So let's go into them one at a time first. Then I'm going to show you a little bit about molecular chemistry and how it interacts with radiation. So the first one is the record of warming. Here it is the record of global average temperature as measured at the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, which is a NASA laboratory, and in New York City. And what you see is along the abscissa from 1880 to now. Here is 1880, and here we are. This has actually the end of 2011 included. And what you see is two curves. The black one is the annual mean temperature, and the red one is a little more smooth, the 5-year mean. So these are departures from some long-term average of global average temperatures. So in the beginning it was below that average, and now has been going up at this incredible rate. And you may wonder, so it says here that the envelope, that is, if you were to sort of make an envelope around the fluctuations, what you would all agree with is that the temperature as a whole is going up, but that there are ups and downs and a lot of natural variability. For example, there was a huge El Nino during one of these right here in 1990. This big tip here was due to a big volcano, and some of these others were large volcanic eruptions. So usually a volcano causes cooling for a few years, and El Nino causes warming. So a lot of the fluctuations can be attributed to those kinds of causes. But in general, what you see is a trend upwards. So over the last century or so, the temperature of our planet has gone up, maybe 0.7 or 0.8 degrees Celsius. So if you go Fahrenheit, you double that. So it's been more than a degree Fahrenheit warming, which doesn't sound like very much, but it does have a long effect on ecosystems already and other things. So was this recent warming unusual? Well, I'll show you a graph that I was involved with a few years ago. But what this indicates is going back about 1,000 years. What you see is a warm period right in the middle of the early Middle Ages here. You're about the year 1000. And then a rather cool period here, which is sometimes referred to as the Little Ice Age. And then this enormous dry upward. So these are different data sets that come from tree rings. This particular one here comes from borehole temperatures where the heating is diffusing down into the earth, so you can recover the past temperatures from looking at those records. And other things such as glacier lengths, that's the blue one, and so on. So many different data sets that are independent of one another all tell us the same story. That it's been warming and warming pretty rapidly. Here's yet one more piece of evidence about the warming. This is the area covered by sea ice in the northern hemisphere. And what you see here is beginning in 1970. This is the beginning of the satellite era, where we were able to look down at the satellites, so-called space age. So during that time, we were able to look down from polar orbiting satellites and determine the area of sea ice. And what you see over many different satellites and so on, you can piece this together. It's a very accurate measurement. And what you see is the amount of sea ice, the area of sea ice in the northern hemisphere is going down. Now there are many other data sets like this, and I won't go into any more of them. This is enough to give you an idea of the kind of data that we're talking about. All of it consistent, all of it indicating the same thing. What about the cause? Well, the second pillar is that we are suffering huge increases in greenhouse gases. This is a record here going back 10,000 years. This is called the Holocene period of the last 10,000 years. Before that, there was a rather large ice sheet covering a good bit of North America, but by 10,000 years ago, almost all of that ice was gone. And so during this period, the temperature of the carbon dioxide has been rather steady until this rise here, just in the last century, 2 centuries. So let's take a look over here at the window where it's blowing up. And what you see is that there's a kind of exponential rise in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And it really started right at the end of the 18th century when an area that at the time we called the Industrial Revolution. The steam engine was patented, I believe, in the 1760s. And so that was the beginning of the age of the railroad, coal burning, and so forth. So at that point, humans began putting CO2 into the atmosphere faster than the system could absorb it. So CO2 began its exponential rise. And here is a more recent record taken by a famous chemist by the name of Keely, a chemist who set up shop on Mount, let's see, I can't remember the name, I was in Hawaii. So he took daily measurements during all this time. These are Januaries, all of the Januaries going back to the middle 1950s. He suspected that CO2 was Mauna Loa, is the mountaintop, by the way. He suspected that CO2 was going up, and so he did very careful measurements using the best tools he had for analytical chemistry throughout this period. So these are the Januaries, and what you see is now we're up to about 393 parts per million. That means by head count, for every 1 million air molecules, we are now at about 393 carbon dioxide molecules. And so this seems to be going up at a rate of about 0.5% per year. There are other greenhouse gases also that are increasing. And so the effective amount of increase is about 1% per year, if you include the other greenhouse gases. And I don't want to go on and on with more data. What I'd like to do is show you the theory of why we expect this connection to happen. Why is it that the CO2 causes the temperature to go up? Well, let's see if we can explain that. So it really all depends upon the energy balance of our planet. Our planet receives radiation from the sun, and that tends to warm the planet. If the sun were to increase its brightness, the temperature of the planet would go up. Decrease its brightness, the temperature of the planet would go down. But our Earth doesn't just receive radiation, it also emits radiation out to space. So over here is the part that's received from the sun, the rate at which energy is taken in from the sun and absorbed. We've all been out on a sunny day and experienced that, especially here in Texas. And on the right is the amount of energy released to space. So energy is constantly coming in at a certain rate. It's also constantly being emitted back to space. When these two rates balance one another, we're in an equilibrium. And so it's a little bit like supply and demand. When the two balance, we're in business. So our planet is roughly in balance, at least when averaged over a number of years, not in individual seasons, but over many years, we think it's balanced. And there's very good evidence of this, by the way. We have satellites going around the Earth, and we'll see some data in a few minutes. Satellites going around the Earth that do measure the amount of sunlight coming in and how much is reflected back. And they also measure the amount of infrared radiation upwelling from the Earth that we received and measured by the satellite. And we see that these two rates are very close together. So here's a diagram showing that particular thing. On the right, you see the solar radiation coming in, and here's Earth radiating out in all directions into space, only coming to the right though from the sun. So the Earth's silhouette, its disk, receives sunlight, and some of it is absorbed, most of it, about 70% is absorbed in the Earth's atmosphere system, and about 30% is reflected back to space. So we can actually take this balance, equilibrium is reached when the balance is achieved. So, in other words, if the planet is a little bit too cool, under balance, what will happen is more sunlight will come in. If it's too cool, more sunlight will come in and heat the planet up until the outgoing radiation is balancing the heat. If the planet is too hot, the outgoing radiation will exceed the incoming, and so it will cool back to equilibrium. So it's a beautiful, stable equilibrium. Small perturbations tend to decay away and bring it back to equilibrium. So those are the natural fluctuations that you saw in that record. It gets a kick away from equilibrium and comes right back. So we can actually compute the temperature of the Earth using elementary physics. First of all, there's no greenhouse gases in this particular calculation. So it turns out that nitrogen, oxygen, and argon are perfectly transparent in the infrared part of the spectrum. I'll tell you what the infrared part of the spectrum is in a moment. But let's just take it to the total going out. So if we look at the balance, it says that this is the amount of radiation being radiated out to space in terms of watts per square meter on the planet. Remember, it's 4 pi r squared for the area of the Earth, but the intercepted area is only a disk, pi r squared. So this is the solar constant, the amount of sunlight reaching a perpendicular square meter of sunlight. And then this is the 70%. Here's the 30% called the albedo, the planetary albedo. So the difference between is about 70%. And we know those figures very accurately. So notice, first of all, it doesn't care what the radius of the Earth is. That cancels out. And we can easily do the arithmetic and find that the Earth's temperature turns out in this calculation to be about 255 degrees Kelvin. But in fact, you see, the real Earth actually has a temperature about 32 degrees warmer than that. So what's wrong? Why isn't this thing designed? That's the question. So what I'd like to do is show you then with a kind of what I call an empirical introduction to the story. If we look at, now down here is temperature, so these are data, this density plot here is data taken from a satellite, from a picture, from a paper that I wrote many, many years ago, back before you were even born. This was a paper that I wrote long, long ago with these two very fine young people. And so down here is the temperature of the surface, and the satellite is going over, like this one, going around the planet. And what it's doing is collecting the infrared radiation upwelling from the planet. And what it found was that if you measure the outgoing radiation in watts per square meter like this, and you look down at that particular point, each one of these little squares, there would be a point on the Earth at a time during the year, what you find is that if the temperature is higher at that particular point on the surface, the outgoing radiation will be higher. And in fact, it looks something like this. But if Earth were governed by the same rule that I used on the previous slide, the curve would have looked like this. In other words, there's something quite different between the outgoing radiation from our planet and the case with no greenhouse gases. So it must be that greenhouse gases, clouds, water vapor somehow are changing the outgoing radiation. And so we can get a solution. This is basically the calculation that we just did, where you find if this is the amount of SOAR, this is the brightness of the sun times 1 minus the albedo, or the 70%. So that number turns out to be independent of temperature. The Earth doesn't care the amount of SOAR does not care what the temperature is. And so if I set that equal to the amount of radiation going out, I'll get a root. And that root tells me the temperature that our planet would have. And you can see that the planetary average temperature is about minus 18 or so degrees Celsius. But suppose I choose, though, to not use that and use the temperature, but use the relationship between outgoing radiation for the real Earth as measured by the satellites and the temperature. What I get is a root, yes, but it's way over here. So it is, in fact, much warmer than the planet that we dealt with a few minutes ago. So this is called the natural greenhouse effect. The fact that our planet is much warmer than it would be if it had no greenhouse gases or clouds. So now let's ask ourselves, what happens if I were to double the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Well, we actually know how to alter the curve, and this is what you get. The straight line that we see here is actually parallel but brought down just a tad, just a little bit. So doubling the CO2 only changes the amount of outgoing radiation by 3 or 4 watts per square meter. And so what happens though is the loop then has to move to the right, just a tad. So this little bit is the greenhouse effect that we're talking about in global warming. So you see, it's superimposed on what's already a very large greenhouse effect. In fact, our planet would probably be uninhabitable by humans if there were no greenhouse effect. So we're very happy that there is a greenhouse effect. What we're not so happy about is if we warm it up, it's going to cost a lot of money and a lot of discomfort for us if we have to deal with it. So that's the question. And I'm not going to tell you what we should do about it. That's somebody else's business. All I'm interested in here is science. So let's get on with the story. So the moral of the story is that if you double the carbon dioxide, it causes a tiny warming, something like 3 plus minus 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this is called the climate sensitivity. So it's a number that we would all like to get. We only know it about 50%. So 3 degrees for doubling, plus or minus 1.5. So if it's 4.5 degrees, this is going to be a lot of discomfort. If it's only 1.5 degrees, we can probably live with it and adapt to it. And we probably would be able to do that. But, so we have this large uncertainty right here, for plus minus 1.5 degrees. So this has been essentially the same. We understand climate a whole lot more 30 years later than this field really began about 30 years ago, 35 years ago, is when I really first got into it. But why the big uncertainty? Well, there are really 2 reasons. One of them is aerosols and clouds. Aerosols are tiny particles suspended in the air. You've seen the smog, air pollution, and so on. There are a lot of natural ones. But also, when we emit gases into the atmosphere, we often cause all kinds of oddball things to happen, such as when the ozone and things like that interact with plants. They can cause the fumes from plants can breathe aerosols. So there's a lot of interaction between biosphere and chemicals that are released into the atmosphere. And often down the chain of reactions before that part actually happens. So one of our big problems is aerosols. Why aerosols? Why are they such a big deal? Aerosols tend to reflect sunlight back to space. And so they do get themselves involved in the energy balance of the planet. So we don't understand them as well as we would like to. We've been studying them for 30 years. Luckily, right here at Texas A&M, we have an expert, one of the great experts in this field, Randy Zahn. I don't know if he's here tonight or not. I think he was planning to be here. But he is one of the great experts. He has a joint appointment between atmospheric sciences and chemistry. Another big unknown is cloud and other feedbacks. And I'll talk a little bit more about these in a few minutes. But clouds, you cannot get the clouds from the simple analysis that I've shown you here, or anything that I'm going to show you tonight. But what we think is that when we increase the temperature because of doubling CO2, other things all of a sudden start to come into play. And we'll talk about those in a minute. Those are the so-called feedbacks in the climate system. They might amplify the warming, or they might diminish it. So we'll talk about that. Well, let's think about the absorption of infrared radiation by carbon dioxide. And I hope I don't lose you all. If you get lost for a few seconds, hang on. I'll try to get you back. So the absorption of carbon dioxide by carbon dioxide of upwelling infrared radiation into the atmosphere. You see, clearly what's going on is the stuff in the atmosphere is interfering with the outgoing radiation from down below, and it's emitting it from high in the atmosphere where it's cold. In fact, the temperature up there is about 255 Kelvin. So how does it work its way up, and why doesn't it leak all the way through? That's the question we'd like to answer. Well, we have to talk a little bit about electromagnetic radiation, and I'll do that in just a moment. But radiation is composed of different wavelengths, and I think all of you have probably had some exposure to this in your physics, high school physics, or in maybe in your chemistry class. But chemists are very interested in this kind of work, in this kind of problem. The spectrum, that is to say, the wavelength dependence. So when infrared goes out, it's a whole bunch of different wavelengths. And it's below the portion where we can see. So it's outside the visible range. And we could do demonstrations here with infrared that show that there is really a light beam, but it's not part of our eyes to see. So infrared, and maybe you've even seen these things they're used in the military, especially in the Vietnam War. I remember people were looking for other people in the jungle, and if you had an infrared camera, you could look and see that warm body come out from behind a tree about to shoot you, and so you would have something to that you'd be able to understand. So infrared does radiate, it radiates from warm bodies, but it also can be reflected, and it can work its way up from the ground, out the top of the atmosphere, where in fact though it's radiating from a cooling surface. Alright, but the spectrum of absorption is extremely complicated, and I thought it would be fun to show you some of the spectrum. And we'll do that. So inside, as chemists use the array of spikes that we're going to see, it's a very spiky absorption spectrum across the wave numbers or frequencies. Chemists use these spikes to identify chemical species. So you can actually use this technique to identify in analytical chemistry to identify different species in a gas or even a liquid. And you can also use it to probe molecular structures. So chemists use it for that purpose too, especially in complicated organic compounds. So a reason for very complicated spectrum is due to the quantum transitions that happen from one rotational state to another, and I'm going to show you a little bit about that. So you won't be completely, you won't leave here without learning any chemistry. Alright, so homonuclear diatomics are transparent. So if these two guys have the same atom, then it turns out that the infrared will go right through. And you'll see why in just a few minutes. Also, monatomics, like argon, the infrared goes right through. But usually diatomics make very good greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide. Water vapor is really an even stronger one than CO2. And ozone, methane, and many others. All of the spray can gases are great greenhouse gases. And that's another whole story. So, what is an electromagnetic wave? Well, it's light, but it can even be a radio wave. It goes over many orders of magnitude in length. So this distance between crests of the wave is called the wavelength. And this wave happens to be propagated down this way. I'm wondering, I got this off the internet, I'm wondering, I think that guy must have thought it was going that way, but if you take the electric field and the cross product with the magnetic, it goes this way. So, if we have a look, what happens is, as these waves go by, if there is an oscillator, some kind of a spring-loaded thing that's just oscillating, it will have a natural frequency. And if this wave goes by, and if the molecule is excitable by an electric wave, like water, with water molecules are very polar and they really get mixed up by this electric wave going through. Same with CO2 and the other polyatomic gases, most of them, many of them. So as it goes by, it's traveling at the speed of light, but as it goes by, it gives the molecule a jiggle with a certain frequency. And these molecules all have their own natural frequencies, like the swing here that the little girl is on. And if you come up to the swing with the girl and you give it a push, and when it comes back you give it another push, and another push, well, her amplitude she'll transfer energy from you onto the swing. But if you come up and you erratically push it, sometimes you'll be out of phase and so forth. So, in other words, you have to be at the right frequency to match the mechanical system. If you're at the right frequency, you can transfer energy very efficiently from your pushing to the mechanical response of the swing. And when you do that, if you've made your your frequency of this incoming wave, the ups and downs as it goes by, if you can make it match the frequency of oscillation of that molecule, then it will absorb energy, and you will take energy out of the wave. And that's how it gets absorbed from the infrared beam moving up to the surface. So it gets absorbed by those little molecules in the sky. This one is very busy and I hate it. But I hunted for a better one on the web, and I just couldn't find it today. But it does show us that here, this is a long, many orders of magnitude of wavelength. But we are actually going to use the wave number in our discussion tonight. And it's really 1 over the wavelength. So it's proportional to the frequency of this wave going by. And I had to add these two on and these down here. So in here is a very narrow portion of the so-called electromagnetic spectrum. And down at this end is red light, so visible right at this little tiny window here. So we've blown it up so you can see. So at this end is blue and violet, and down here red. So this is the visible part of the spectrum. The infrared part of the spectrum lies at longer wavelengths or lower frequencies, so it's next to the visible, but just down below it. So that's all you need to know about that. But if you look at the distribution of energy going out from our planet Earth, it isn't all going at the same wavelength. In fact, there's a distribution. This is like the distribution of grades in Dr. North's class. Where is he? There he is. This is like the distribution of all these A students up here. Anyway, so this is like a histogram. And we have an apportionment of the energy according to different wave numbers like this. So it isn't monochromatic. It's not monochromatic. In fact, it's distributed over a rather wide band. So this is the kind of distribution of frequencies that you would expect, or wave numbers that you would expect, if the temperature of the surface of the Earth were about 260. Well, we actually know it's more like 285. But this is what it's like up near the top of the atmosphere. You have a distribution something like that. Now, how do the molecules interact? Well, we talked a little bit about that. Photons, which are these little tiny wave packets, they can be scattered or they can be absorbed. And we showed how they can be absorbed. It's when you match the frequency, then you'll transfer a lot of energy right out of the wave into the internal motion of the molecule. So if the frequency of passing crests of radiation matches one of the internal frequencies of the two molecules, resonance will occur. And here is an example of resonance. This is the famous Tacoma Narrows Bridge in 1940. And what happened here was the wind was blowing just right. This bridge had been in operation for decades. And this one day there was a terrible windstorm, and it was blowing with just the right turbulent eddies around the bridge, or just at the right frequency to excite some of the natural frequencies of this bridge. Turned out they were not the waves like this. The thing was torsion. In other words, the bridge was twisted. And that was enough. So you transferred a tremendous amount of energy from the wind into this mechanical motion, so much so that the bridge completely fell apart. And I'm sure you can find films of it. Many of you have seen it. You can find film of this maybe somewhere on YouTube. So just put in Tacoma Narrows Bridge and you'll probably find it. All right, so not so fast. So slow down, Professor. The absorption of the infrared by molecules is pretty damn complicated, and it's very messy. So I want to show you a little bit of this, just to give you a little feeling for how complicated some of these things are, and how difficult the problem of climate change is, at least in this one particular aspect. So most atmospheric gases are transparent, as we said. They don't have any dipole moment that the electromagnetic field can hook onto. They don't feel it. If they're not charged or something, they won't feel it. And that's why they do. So some trace gases are selectively absorbed, and here is the man. We found this in the middle of the 19th century, John Tyndall, and he he put an apparatus together. He really didn't know much about the wavelengths or any of the rest, but he knew that when he heated the body, it emitted this kind of radiation. And he showed that if you put water vapor into the chamber where the gas, where the radiation was going through, that the water vapor would absorb some of that radiation. And he also tried CO2 and other gases. So many people really think that greenhouse gases should not be called greenhouse gases, they should be called $10 gases. So here's another famous physicist, famous fact in the 19th century. So here's our CO2 molecule. It's linear like this, and when the radiation passes through, it has several modes of vibration. So it has more than one natural frequency. The baby on the spring only has one natural frequency. If you just have a mass on the spring, only one. But if you have a complicated assemblage like this, where you have a spring here and a spring here, you can have a number of frequencies, and I'll just show you that. I'm going to skip that. But here is a diagram that shows you how the three kinds of frequencies that you can have. This one is one where the two oxygens are going like this. And then the one in the middle, I don't think I can do that one. Let's see, the carbon goes one way and the oxygen on the other side goes the other. So it's something like that. And then there's the one that's a bending mode, and this is the one that's most important in the greenhouse. Okay? So what's happening here is the oxygens are doing this. And so they each have their own characteristic frequency or wave number. And so this one has a wave number resonance at about 677 inverse centimeters. So if you look back here at my so 667 is right in the middle of this. So this upwelling radiation runs into a buzzsaw. In other words, all of the energy is going to be sucked out of the wave as it's coming up and absorbed by the molecular gases, or the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So that's what we're going to look at. But I'm going to show you just for fun how complicated this spectrum is. Up above is the outgoing spectrum, as you might see from the satellite, if there were no greenhouse gases except CO2. And here's the big dip in the spectrum right at this band. So there's a huge dip in the outgoing radiation right in this wavelength interval. And if you take just this portion and spread it out and look at the lines in here, these are the absorption lines for CO2 in that particular band. Is this band or what? Okay, now you take yet another one. Take that one and then look inside of it. And one more inside there. So you see this one is only from 665 to 669. And look how many there are. So the number of lines across that spectrum where the radiation is going out is something like 400,000. It's a huge number of it. But, these things have been studied now for quite a few years, and we really have a pretty good idea what's going on. Okay, let me just show you here, now that we know that the spectral lines, the absorption lines of these gases are very, very discrete, like the teeth of a comb, only 400,000 teeth. So these now are, each one of these points represents one of those lines, or a bundle of lines. Actually here they've been bundled together into maybe 100 of each one of these little dots. The blue are water vapor, and the red are CO2. There it is. So here you see is our outward rate. So here is the CO2 that's causing that big dent. All right. So what about some other gases? Well, there are a bunch of other greenhouse gases. And if you look here, and up here they are. I cannot read them back here, but I think that's CO and a bunch of others. But actually what you see is that their intensities are a couple of orders of magnitude below the ones on the previous row. See, there they are. And you see there, this is logarithmic scale. So here, this is like 1,000, 10 to the 3, 10 to the 2, 10 to the 1, And on the next graph, you see there kind of the minus 2 in the minus 1. So these are not so important. But they in total, they all are important, really. And we're learning more and more about them every day that goes by. For example, the spray can gases that we use are terrible greenhouse gases. And even though we've now replaced the ones that cause loss of ozone in the stratosphere, the new ones are still greenhouse gases. But Dow and other companies that make these gases for spray cans and refrigerants and so on are actually in the process of devising gases that will not be greenhouse gases. Okay, which is a very, very encouraging thing. So the transfer of radiant energy up through the atmosphere is really complicated. And so here are some things that make it complicated. Well, you need to take into account the fact that the radiation is angular. So that comes into account. Very irregular absorption, we already saw that. Elevation dependence of temperature in the cloud. And then clouds and other things are going on too. I'm going to go quickly through this just to give you an idea how these computations have been carried out. This might be a tiny volume element in the atmosphere, and so this volume element emits radiation in all directions, upward but also downward. In fact, if you ever stand out on a warm day, especially this evening, a lot of the radiation you're getting is not just from the sun, it's from the sky. It's radiating infrared up here. If you've ever noticed it. Okay, so here is our tiny volume L0. So it also absorbs from all directions. So what you have to do is make a stack of slabs like this in your computers and look at the way the infrared works its way up. But you see it's complicated because as you go up, the temperature of the Earth is going down. And the CO2, here's CO2, it's pretty well mixed through all of this is 0 kilometers, 10 kilometers, 20, and so forth. And down here is the temperature. So what you see is the temperature is going down until you get to what's called the tropopause, then it starts back. Here's water vapor, it's mostly confined down the lower portion of the atmosphere. But the radiation has to work its way up through this column. And that's complicated. And it took quite a number of years. Luckily, we've been working on this problem. People have been theorizing and really thinking hard about this problem for almost 75 years. So there has been a lot of progress made theoretically, and now we also have very good computer codes that help us get through this. So we take all of those lines into account and everything. And in this particular model that I'm using here, it's a pretty simple one that bundles the lines together. But what you see here is the big greenhouse ditch, right in the middle of the outline spectrum. And so what we find is that this is a planet with no greenhouse gases, and this line here is the curve that you would have if there were no, in other words, this is, that's the temperature here, 300 degrees, so it's about the temperature of the surface, okay? And so everywhere else is radiating directly from the surface out to space, except right here where it's being intercepted. And I think this is also CO2. It might be. So here is the natural greenhouse effect that we talked about. But there's one other thing going on. Namely, when you put in the CO2, you lose this much infrared going out to space. So the Earth has got to warm up a little bit to make up for it. So it's going to warm up. When it warms up, though, like that much. In fact, the integral there is proportional to energy, the area of that block. So Earth has to warm up several degrees Celsius to restore the balance when that happens. Another thing happens. When the Earth begins to warm up, water vapor begins to evaporate into the atmosphere. So, roughly speaking, the atmospheric water vapor is around 80% humidity most of the time of year and most of the places on Earth, especially over oceans. And so what you see is that actually the temperature at which the radiation is occurring out in space is no longer the surface. It's just near the surface here, but a lot of it is way below the surface. So see here is 280, so it's 20, 30 degrees colder than the surface. And so here again is our big CO2 dish. But the rest of this is water vapor. So and look at this one over here, way down. So if you were to take the area of this curve between the green curve up there, which would represent the bare planet, and this, that would give you an idea of how much the total energy has been, the rate of energy released has been diminished. So what has to happen is the Earth has to warm up in order to balance it. Well, that's the natural greenhouse effect. Now what we'll do is let's double the CO2. It turns out it's not a big effect. You see, we have all this reduction from, that's the natural greenhouse effect, bring it down to 300. I found this one on the website, so I didn't have to do it again. But what you find is that if you double the CO2 from 300 parts per million to 600, what you get is this little stuff in the wings here. It's just a little small amount. But it's about 3.4 watts per square meter. It's silly to have that many significant figures, but something like that. And that's the value. And if you were to go into a really super duper good greenhouse radiator transfer model, this is what you would find if you were going from about 300 or 400 to 800. You would get about for 3.9 watts per square meter. And when you do that, the increase is about 1 degree Celsius. But then, you double the CO2, you get 1 degree Celsius. But other things then kick in. And what are they? Summary for the doubling. Let's just summarize this. The doubling of CO2, holding everything else constant, leads to a warming of about 1 degree Celsius. So if you don't do anything else, here we are at the present time, you double the CO2, temperature goes up by 1 degree. Water vapor, when water vapor issues into the atmosphere because of this warming, new water vapor will appear. And what happens then is the water vapor feedback essentially doubles this to 2 degrees. And cloud feedback is yet another one. We don't really fully understand it yet, but all the evidence suggests that it might, doubling is probably too large, but it might very well kick it up another half a degree or even more. So these, the water vapor one, doubling, these are meteorology problems. They come about because of the way the whole global atmospheric system responds, all of its winds and all the rest. So here's where we have to put chemistry aside a little bit and worry about those problems. So the uncertainties in these and other small feedbacks are the reason for this 1.5 degrees Celsius uncertainty that we worry so much about. And as I said earlier, this uncertainty has not gone down. The guess in 1980 was 3 degrees plus minus 1 10. We're still there. We understand it a whole lot better than we did then, but it has not diminished. There's a lot more work to be done. Again, this wouldn't be so interesting if it turned out that that's what we were going to have. But we don't know that. Maybe we're at the point. Anyway, so here's the bottom lines I'd like you to take. Earth is warming rapidly. Greenhouse gas increases are the likely reason. We've looked at all kinds of other possibilities. And believe me, if there were one, the guy who found it, or the gal who found it, would win the Nobel Prize right now. So there's a lot of incentive to find some other reason than anything. Greenhouse gases reduce the outgoing radiation to space, causing a warming to occur in order to restore the balance. In order to estimate these effects, the science of molecular absorption spectroscopy is used. Well, we've pretty much got that one done now. I think we do understand that. But there are still complicated things that we don't understand, and I won't go into them, but the folks on the front row here, I'm sure can think of reasons why there might be other infrared absorbers as well. For example, clusters of water molecules, things like that, and that process. Okay, so take home more news. Details of how the imbalance of the Earth's radiation affect climate requires the interaction of chemistry, atmospheric, and the other earth sciences. So this is really where we have to get into the global model. The other big uncertainties include feedback mechanisms. And we understand the water vapor one pretty well. Probably double the response. It's a positive feedback. Clouds probably also are in positive feedback. It's almost impossible to measure. We can do it in our models, and we make models that look an awful lot like the real weather systems going around the Earth. They look a lot like it, and they all give us positive feedback. But one model will differ from another. And their effect on climate sensitivity. So aerosols, I mentioned this before, this is one of the great outstanding problems. And I think that there will be plenty of work for us to do in the next 50 years, while all of you are trying, when all of you get to my age, you will have done a good 50 years worth of good chemistry work, and there's a lot of good work to be done for chemistry connected to climate change. That's all I have. Thank you.